Okay, so get this. We're diving into whether Canada could actually join the EU.
Ooh.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It sounds kind of wild. But stick with us on this one. You might be surprised by what we found in this article called, "With its U.S. alliance under pressure, could Canada join the EU?" Yeah,
Interesting.
it talks about how things between Canada and the U.S. are kind of strained,
Hmm.
and now some people are looking across the Atlantic.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting is that even though it seems far-fetched at first, it really makes you think about how alliances work, in this shifting world.
Exactly. And the article gets right into the legal stuff.
Hmm.
It mentions Article 49 of something called the Treaty on European Union. That's the one that outlines the requirements for joining.
Right. The catch is that the treaty doesn't actually say what European means. So
Oh.
it's open to interpretation. There's actually a case like this in the past. Back in 1987, Morocco tried to join the EU, but they were rejected because they weren't considered European enough.
So they've always had this kind of geographical limit. But this article argues that Canadians could be considered honorary Europeans because of, like, shared values and historical ties. For example, Canada and the EU have similar stances on things like gun control, the death penalty, and social safety nets.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, there's definitely a strong case to be made. Their political and legal systems are also based on European models. Plus, over half of Canadians say they have European ancestry, so the connections are there.
It makes you wonder if that shared background really affects a country's policies and how they see the world today.
Yeah.
But even if there's that cultural connection, are there any actual benefits for either side if this crazy thing actually happened?
Well, the article does point out some potential wins for both. Canada has tons of natural resources like rare earth minerals and fossil fuels, and those are in high demand in Europe. On the other hand, the EU has a huge skilled labor market that could really benefit Canada.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And wouldn't this also give Canada some breathing room from its dependence on the U.S., especially with all the political stuff happening down
Oh,
there?
absolutely. Strategically, a closer relationship with the EU would give Canada more options, and they wouldn't be so vulnerable to whatever's going on in U.S. politics. It's all about diversifying alliances these days.
Yeah.
But let's be real for a second. Legally, maybe there's a tiny chance, and yeah, there could be benefits. But could this really happen?
I feel like you're about to crush my dreams here.
Let's just say the odds aren't great.
Okay, lay it on me.
Yeah.
What are the biggest roadblocks?
Well, for starters, the EU already has a long list of countries waiting to join. Some have been waiting for decades. It would be a diplomatic nightmare to prioritize Canada, a country that's so far away over those already in line.
That's a tough spot for the EU. It makes you think about how they balance who gets in with what's happening in the world.
Exactly. Plus, you have to think about what people in the EU think. There isn't a ton of support for expanding the union, especially to include a country that's not in Europe. And don't forget, every EU member has to agree on decisions. The more members there are, the harder it gets to get everyone on the same page.
So realistically, full EU membership for Canada is a long shot. But the article does talk about other ways they could work together. Do you think those are more likely?
Oh, absolutely. There are some really interesting possibilities. One is what they call advanced cooperation.
Hmm.
Basically, that means taking the relationship they already have to a whole new level. More trade, more research collaborations, and getting on the same page with foreign policy.
So more like a really close partnership, but without officially being members.
Exactly. Another possibility is forming new alliances with other countries that have similar values. It might mean creating a group of countries with a shared vision for the world, maybe even leaving the U.S. out. This
Cool.
could give Canada a bigger voice on the world stage without depending so much on its neighbor to the south.
That's a fascinating idea. Are there any examples of how the EU already does this kind of partnership?
Actually, there are a bunch. For example, they have this European neighborhood policy where they work with countries like Armenia and Tunisia on things like sharing resources. Then there's the European Economic Area. It's a free trade group with countries like Norway that aren't full EU members. And of course, there are separate agreements like Schengen, which is about visa-free travel, and the Eurozone, which has a shared currency.
So it's more like a menu of options. Canada could choose what works best.
Exactly.
Huh.
And they're already trying some of them out. They're part of Horizon Europe, which is the EU's big research program. What's interesting is that other countries outside Europe, like New Zealand, are also involved.
It seems like the EU might be shifting its thinking away from just getting bigger and towards these strategic partnerships instead. But let's not forget about the elephant in the room. Canada and the US are super close. How would closer ties with Europe affect that?
That's a crucial point. The U.S. is Canada's biggest trading partner and a close ally when it comes to security. Replacing that relationship wouldn't be easy or quick. Europe is a great partner, but it can't completely replace the U.S. in terms of economic and military power.
And what about within Canada itself? Are there any challenges there that could make things complicated?
Definitely. The different provinces often disagree on things that are important to the EU, like climate policy and agriculture. Plus, Canadian businesses have always focused on the U.S. market. It would take a lot of time and effort to shift that focus to Europe.
So there's a lot to overcome, both within Canada and in its relationship with the U.S. Are there any other risks we should be thinking about?
Well, one of the biggest risks is making the U.S. angry. Deepening ties with Europe could be seen as a threat, which could make things even worse between them. It's a really delicate balancing act for Canada.
It sounds like Canada's walking a tightrope, trying to get closer to the EU without upsetting its powerful neighbor. This deep dive has been really eye-opening. We've talked about the legal stuff, the potential benefits, and the realistic alternatives for Canada when it comes to the EU, but there's still so much to unpack.
Welcome back to our deep dive into whether Canada could join the EU.
So we've already talked about how full membership is a long shot, but this whole conversation has me thinking about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What would a closer relationship with the EU mean for Canada's place in the world?
That's a great question. It really challenges us to think beyond just the practical stuff and consider how things might change in the long run when it comes to global alliances.
Right. It's like this thought experiment is making us look at the world map in a whole new way.
Exactly. And one thing that really stood out to me in the article was how much they emphasized shared values. It highlights how much Canada and the EU agree on things like gun control, the death penalty, and social safety nets.
Yeah, it's like they're on the same page when it comes to social and political ideals.
Precisely. And this shared worldview goes beyond just what happens within their own borders. They also see eye to eye on big global issues like climate change, working together as a group, and human rights.
So it's not just about economics, it's a deeper connection.
Exactly. The article even uses the phrase enlightened West to describe this shared vision. And that made me think about how a Canada-EU alliance could actually influence what's considered normal and right in the world.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. It's like they could team up to make the world a fairer, more just and sustainable place.
Precisely. That kind of shared commitment could be the foundation for a really amazing partnership. But of course, we can't ignore the elephant in the room. The United States-Canada's relationship with its neighbor is complicated, to say the least.
For sure. The U.S. is Canada's biggest trading partner and a key ally when it comes to security. Any move toward Europe would have to be carefully thought out so it doesn't mess up that important relationship.
Absolutely. It's a balancing act. Canada doesn't want to upset the U.S., but it also needs to be able to make its own decisions and diversify its alliances. This is where the idea of strategic autonomy comes in.
Strategic autonomy. I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I totally get it. Can you explain it?
Think of it as a country's ability to decide what it wants to do in terms of foreign policy and security without being controlled by other countries.
So it's about having the freedom to do what's best for you, even if it means disagreeing with your allies sometimes.
Exactly. For Canada, achieving strategic autonomy means finding that balance between its relationships with the U.S. and Europe.
It sounds tricky. How can Canada actually do that? What specific things can it do?
Well, one important step is to keep building stronger ties with the EU, expanding trade, working together on research, and finding solutions for global problems like climate change and security.
So building a stronger, more independent relationship with Europe without completely ditching the U.S.
Precisely. It's about having more choices and more power in a world that's constantly changing and hard to predict.
It's like having a backup plan, just in case things go wrong with the U.S., which is always a good idea these days. Are there other things Canada can do besides getting closer to the EU?
Another important step is investing in its own military. This doesn't mean trying to become a superpower, but it does mean being able to protect itself without always needing help from the U.S.
So it's about being self-sufficient when it comes to security. That makes sense. It would give Canada more authority on the world stage. But this whole conversation has made me wonder about something else. How would closer ties with Europe affect how Canadians see themselves?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a complicated issue. Would closer ties with Europe make Canadians feel more European? Or would it make them feel like they have a unique identity that's different from both the U.S. and Europe?
It's like Canada's at a crossroads trying to figure out where it belongs in the world.
Exactly. There's no simple answer, but it's something Canadians will have to figure out as they plan for the future.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to all the different aspects of Canada's relationship with the EU. There's so much more to it than I realized.
It's a relationship that's always changing and evolving, and it's definitely worth paying attention to.
Hmm.
It has the potential to change not just where Canada stands in the world, but also the bigger picture of how global alliances work.
Welcome back to the deep dive. It feels like we've been on this incredible journey.
It really has. We've covered so much from the legal stuff to like potential benefits and the challenges. But what do you think is the most important thing we've learned?
I think for me, it's realizing that even though Canada joining the EU is probably not going to happen, just thinking about it changes how we see alliances and partnerships.
I totally agree. It challenges the old idea that alliances are all about geography. We're seeing that shared values can be just as important even when countries are far apart.
Right. It's like the rules are changing, and Canada's in a great spot to make the most of it.
Exactly. Think about it. Canada's always been good at bringing people together on the world stage. Now, with all these changes in alliances, Canada could become even more influential.
So instead of being stuck between the US and Europe, Canada could actually help shape a whole new world order.
Precisely. And the article talks about how Canada could do that. It says Canada could use its reputation for diplomacy and working with other countries to bring everyone together to solve big problems like climate change, pandemics, cybersecurity.
Yeah, it sounds like Canada could be a leader in global cooperation at a time when the world really needs it.
Exactly. And that fits perfectly with what the EU wants. They want a world where everyone's connected and working together. They could be great partners.
Right. It's not just about what's good for them. It's about working together to make things better for everyone.
And let's not forget about the economic side. The article mentions that Canada and the EU could work together on research and development, which would lead to new innovations and economic growth.
So it's a win-win.
Wow.
Both sides benefit from sharing what they know and what they have.
Absolutely. This could be really important for Canada as it tries to branch out its economy and not rely so much on the U.S. market.
That goes back to the idea of strategic autonomy that we talked about. By getting closer to Europe, Canada can be more independent and in control of its own future.
Exactly. It's about having more choices and more power in a world that's getting more complicated and unpredictable every day.
So even if Canada never actually joins the EU, just thinking about it has been really valuable.
No doubt about it. It's made us question what we thought we knew and be more creative about how we see Canada's role in the world. And I think that's what's so great about these deep dives.
I totally agree. It's not just about finding answers, it's about asking the right questions.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to think about what all of this means for Canada. What does it mean for how Canadians see themselves, for their economy, and for their place in the world? How can Canada navigate all of this and find its own way forward?
Wow, those are some big questions. But that's what we love about these deep dives. They give you so much to think about, even after the conversation is over.
So to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep learning about this topic.
Yeah.
Dig deeper, question what you think you know, and let's keep talking about it. Because the future of Canada and where it fits in the world is something we all care about.
Well said. Until next time, keep diving deep.